Hi everyone, my name is Dre. I am an IT consultant in the healthcare industry and the founder of Dragon Consulting. And on today's video, I would like to talk about how to present new ideas. So, for many of us in the healthcare space and in the IT space in particular, there's opportunities all over for new and grand, brilliant ideas, changes that can be made to a system or to processes, things that sort of intersect in the whole clinical and IT world that we want to pitch or communicate or bring forward. So in a lot of instances, there may be times when you've tried explaining the change to some colleagues or to a client or to a leader in the organization, and you've got all sorts of excitement and all sorts of enthusiasm behind you, and you run into a wall when you try to bring it forward to the IT department or with certain leaders in the organization. So that can be very disheartening, and it can actually, you know, stifle your creativity going forward. So I want to talk about why some of those walls seem to be there and how we can adjust the way we present to make it more likely to get over that wall. So, when asking around individuals in the field, I tend to get a lot of feedback from end users and from IT analysts, from consultants, that the response can be summed up in a few different quotes, and that's no one ever listens to us, no one wants to hear my ideas. I get feedback that it was a great concept, but it's not something we could deploy here. Or that there is a constraint that was unknown to the individual with the idea, be that a budget, a timeline, or a resourcing constraint. So these tend to be the most common responses when you sort of quote unquote hit that wall, but let's talk about how we can get through some of those. So first I want to let everybody know that in my experience over the last, decade plus, I have never come across anyone who doesn't want to hear user experiences or ideas, whether that be IT staff or leadership staff or anyone in the organization. So it's not a case of them not wanting to listen to you. They do, by and large, everywhere I've ever been, want to hear ideas on how to improve things. But the challenge seems to be on how those conversations are happening and how the ideas are making their way through the org structure. So where they're actually occurring, not that no one wants to hear them. So ideas gain traction in a few different ways. So you can have an idea gain traction by approaching the message from several different angles. So if there's only one way of communicating a message or an idea and it's not well understood and there isn't an opportunity to reframe that, there's a high chance that it's not going to go much further, because if it's not in the right sort of format or context or reference for the individual hearing it the first time, if there isn't any change to that message, then it's just the same message over and over again. So you want to provide enough detail to satisfy the person that you're communicating with, um, and that you're communicating in a way that describes to the person sort of what their ability to influence the viability and capacity to make that happen is. So present the details of your idea in a way that highlight the benefits, as well as the opportunities or gains that it presents to the receiver and to the larger group. So it needs to be focused on the individual that you're communicating to, as opposed to focused on sort of how the benefit is to you personally. So that tends to open up the door for more conversations, and it's a little easier to get things forward that way. So when you're doing that, there's a basic structure, a presentation structure that the conversation or the actual presentation can have that can help frame it in such a way that it can go forward or get a little bit more traction on discussion. So if it's something that's not going to be implemented or that can't be implemented for some reason, you can at least open the dialogue and have a meaningful discussion as to why or what change might be required. So the presentation structure that I've been finding helpful over time in different roles are, there needs to be, of course, an introduction, a background, a bit of a pitch, so your elevator pitch that's going with it, the benefits that the change or idea is going to bring, a mention of the risks and assumptions, and a closing component. So let's start with the introduction. So anytime you're having a conversation around a new idea or a concept, you need to make sure that the topic is introduced appropriately and that there's some context on the scenario. So the individuals that you're speaking with or presenting to need to understand sort of what context is being framed around the idea and where it is placed within the organization, within their realm of responsibility, or within the general sort of healthcare pathway. You also need to include a description of your desired outcome or what the improvement that you're hoping to achieve is. So let them know what contexts that we're talking about and what it is that the overall goal at a high level is meant to achieve. So next you'll want to provide background information. So things that the recipient might need so that they better understand the elements of your proposal. So if it is something that they're not overly familiar with, or something that they believe is working just great, you'll need to understand background as to why this idea came forward. So what was it? What piece of information, what research, what components, what frustrations are actually behind the concept and behind the idea for change. So you'll want to use this opportunity to show them that you've done your homework. So provide information on what you've looked into so far, why it is that you think a change is necessary, how the idea was formulated. So where did it come from? Were there contributing factors that led you to this particular pathway? Let them know the why behind what you're doing. So why was it looked into in the first place? And what's that picture? What's the story behind it? Next, you'll want to provide your quote unquote pitch. So present a summary version of your idea. You don't necessarily need to go into a super deep dive of information, but provide an overview. What is it that the idea brings forward? If it's for a change or if it's for implementation of something new, describe what it is that you want to have happen. Describe the number of people that would be involved, the processes that might be changed. Is it something that's simple and straightforward? Would it, in your mind, require just some general communication be drafted and a little bit of training? Or is this something that is sort of transformative and significant in magnitude, where there would be multiple changes to IT systems, organizational policies, guidelines, workflows, and let them know in the pitch sort of the size and scope that you're thinking of, so that they can properly formulate and relate it back to that background context. Next, you'll want to focus on benefits. So what are some of the presumed benefits of implementing the idea? So in the introduction, you gave your audience an idea of what your goal was, so what it was that you were looking for from an outcome perspective. And here you want to talk a little bit more detail about how that sort of relates to the change. So with that end goal in mind, what are the benefits to patient care? What are the benefits to patient experience or to staff morale? Are there turnaround times that can be improved? Can you reduce resources for a particular workflow? Is there an opportunity to generate income? Is there some financial benefit? So if it's not income generating, could it be income or expense reducing? Is there an opportunity to provide information from a data and analytics perspective? So is this something that would help capture detailed information that could be utilized and analyzed for future change? So let them know what the benefits are and how those sort of relate and tie back into your idea. You'll also want to provide a little bit of information on risks and assumptions. So these last two, the benefits and the risks, tend to be where a lot of great ideas sort of lose steam in their presentation. So without including information on the benefits and the risks and assumptions that you've got, it can sometimes come across to the individual who is receiving the information from you that you haven't done your due diligence and you haven't really looked into it, that it's sort of just a conceptual thought that you had in the elevator or something that you came up with when you were driving to work this morning. So communicating the benefits and communicating the assumptions and risks in particular will let them know that you actually have thought through this and that you've considered different aspects. And even after that consideration, you do still think that this idea is a viable idea and you'd like to communicate it. So make sure that you summarize any risks that you're aware of. If you do have assumptions, take some time to make note of what those assumptions are and communicate that you have made those so that they can either be included or dispelled. And then comment on any factors or areas that you think could benefit from further investigation. So if you haven't had a chance to sort of deep dive into the risks, or this is in the early stage of its idea formation, let them know that. Let them know that there are certain areas that you think that you should deep dive into. Just communicating that you're thinking of that can tend to give the idea a bit more credibility. So when you're closing off your presentations and when you're sort of letting people know or closing off the conversation, you'll want to conclude with what the request or direction you have for the individual is. So I think probably the number one reason that ideas don't move forward or that it feels as though people may not be listening to the ideas that we have is that we aren't communicating effectively as to what we want the individual to do with the idea that we've just presented to them. So we haven't let them know that we're looking for them to participate in some way in helping us or to do something about the idea that we've just presented. And this actually, if this isn't communicated effectively, it stops the conversation from sort of continuing in its tracks. So you'll want to let, whether it's a verbal conversation that you're having with someone or a full presentation that you're giving to a large group of people, you want to let them know what it is that you're looking for in their response. What is the next action that they need to take? Are you hoping that they're going to support your idea to take it forward? Do you want them to champion your idea and sort of start communicating and taking it forward to see if other people have questions about it or want to discuss it in more detail? Do you want their opinion? Are you looking for guidance on how you can continue to go further? Is there a component of the risks that you wanted to deep dive further in, but you don't know where to start? So let them know what it is that you're looking for and how you want them to follow up. If you don't have a full definition of your idea, so if you haven't quite formulated all the details, it is absolutely okay to also propose the next step as investigation into potential solutions and to ask for assistance on that. Perhaps you can ask for other individuals that you might connect with, areas that you might focus on before you can bring things back, but you will want to make sure that there is some sort of closing action that takes place. And so there's an understanding on both sides of whether or not each individual needs to be involved in the next step. So if it's a formal presentation that you're giving, so hallway conversations or initial conceptual ideas can follow that same structure. But if it is a formal presentation that you're giving, one of the things that you want to make sure you do is you need to include the level of detail in your presentation in each of those different sections that relate and correlate to the type of idea that you have. So whether it's a simple change or a transformative new program, as well as the size of the audience. So if you're speaking to 2 people versus 50 people, you'll want to make sure that the level of detail and the information you're providing correlates with the appropriate audience level. You also want to make sure that depending on who the audience is, that the details are appropriate for that group. So it can be different for different groups of people. So presenting to an IT technical group will be very different than presenting to a leadership or executive group, for example. So you want to make sure that you have your information across those sections, that it can be communicated in such a way that's going to be malleable and adjustable and can provide the level of detail that the people in the audience are looking for. The other thing that you should do, especially for transformative type changes or very large project related changes, is to check with different individuals in a project management office, for example, IT department, clinical department, to see if there's organizational processes that need to be followed for bringing an idea forward. So is there an intake pathway that needs to happen? Are there documents or summary pages that need to be filled out? Is there a sequence that things need to be presented in? You'll want to make sure that that's also taken into consideration, because that can be another spot where ideas sort of uh, tend to seem like they're not moving forward, and it's just because they're not following the path that's been approved. So again, when you're presenting to large formal groups, you'll want to consider the roles and level of responsibility. So identify what aspects of the change or idea that they're likely to focus on, and you want to frame the conversation in a way that aligns with those aspects. So for example, if you are presenting to a group of executives that are representing the finance committee, and you're looking for funding, so if you're presenting your concept and trying to gauge interest in whether or not there could be dollars freed up to implement your change, you want to make sure that you're including information on cost expenditures, savings, timelines that are associated, if there's any resourcing that you think would happen, if this is something that you believe the expertise to implement would be in-house, or whether this is something that you need to go outside for. So pieces like that, as much of them as you know. So again, these will be formulated over time, but you'll want to make sure that those types of things are included when you're presenting to a group like that, because that's where their interest is going to lie. If you're presenting the exact same idea to the quality department, for example, they may not be as interested in the cost expenditure or savings details, and they may be more interested in emphasizing the patient outcomes and having just a summary of the financing. So what is the detailed KPIs for your patient outcomes? Do you have metrics, or how are you going to capture the metrics? What is that going to look like? So same idea is going to be presented to different people in a different way. And as you're bringing an idea forward, it's important to keep that in mind, because if the details that they're looking for are missing from a group that's being presented to, it can sometimes I don't want to say be written off, but it can sometimes just stall because they'll believe that not enough research has been done. So you want to make sure that you've got some framing there. Feel free to reach out to your colleagues, and leaders often in these groups will help you by taking a quick glance at presentations before they're done to see if there's enough detail. So don't feel like you have to go into these blind. There are certainly ways that they can assist with an organization going through this. So in final thoughts, you want to consider approaching your conversations in the same format. So even if you're not to the point where you're presenting an idea to a large group or you're formally presenting for approval, have conversations around that same structure. So the introduction with the background, context, your pitch, some of your benefits and risks identified, as well as your closing, even if they're on a smaller scale. So once you become more comfortable with that type of framework and making sure those are considered, you'll find it a lot easier to communicate an idea in such a way that people will, engage in conversation, and they'll look for follow-up, and they'll want to collaborate, they'll want to do more things. So you may find that it's easier to get things going forward, especially in instances where you're identifying your benefits and risks, and then you're asking in the closing for for the next step. So you're participating in letting them know sort of what you want as your next step. Those could continue moving forward. So if you do practice this in your general conversations, it can be very, very helpful for when it comes time to present that brilliant new idea going forward. And hopefully they don't get stuck along the way, because there's some great ideas out there. All right. So thanks, and I will talk to you again soon.